Good evening and welcome back to Vegas October 1 Sounds. Tonight I'm going to review a cop cam, and the reason for reviewing this patrolman's camera is that it's one that's way out in the boonies, and yet we still can get a viable signal for the purposes of determining lag. And as you remember, lag is the difference in time of arrival between the supersonic crack and the muzzle. And so there have been a lot of statements about you can or cannot hear the supersonic crack at certain distances. And this is just one more example of where that sound was recorded at a distance that's quite unexpected. So the camera I'm referring to is located out in the north by northeast corner of the whole situation, way out there on the corner of Duke Ellington Way and East Reno Avenue. And according to the Las Vegas shooting map, it records volley 11 and 12. And I want to give a big shout out to the people who put together this Las Vegas shooting map. It is an invaluable service, an invaluable compilation of videos, times, and locations. So for the folks that did that, I can't give enough shout-outs. But anyway, back to the video. So this video, which is from batch 7, body cam number 30, it's not too long in terms of what volleys it recorded. It is much longer than that, but just for the purposes of gunshot analysis, it's pretty short. And it starts out, first off, let's figure out how far out it is. So if we drop over to Google Maps and we drop a measuring tool in from that corner to the rooftop of Mandalay Bay, which is about the closest you can get, because once you change it just a little bit to try to get to 32, it drops down. We get about 3,000 feet. So that location is 3/5 of a mile out. Pretty far out in terms of sounds and everything. Alright. So, back to the video. If we watch a little bit of the video, we can see that, as usual, the first 30 seconds don't record any sound. But here's some officers out there in the middle of the street, and we can see them looking, I guess that would be west. And they're directing people over there and everything. And once the sound comes on, we're going to hear some interesting things in terms of, from my perspective anyway. There we go. So it starts off with a loud siren, and that's somebody recording on the radio, a cop shouting. So we got some really loud sounds that are local from shouting.
Let's go! Go! You be safe that way.
And
you be safe that way. Keep going.
In a minute, we're going to have a guy walk by to say something. So, but anyway, let's pause it there, and let's go pull up the sound in Sonic Visualizer, and look at those first few seconds where we hear the siren, and we hear the radio beeps and everything. So, to the left up here, this is the usual setup for Sonic Visualizer, with the simulated power spectrogram on top, a log frequency plot, and then down here we have the waveform. And tonight I'm going to use the waveform more than I have in many occasions, and I'm going to set the waveform to a fixed scale. That is, normally I have this set which allows the waveform to adjust itself to give me the best possible signal view. And to do that, it changes, the apparent gain on it. But tonight I'm going to manually control this so that I can set how big that waveform is. So I can make it just in the outer limits really, really small, or really, really big. And what I'm going to do is set it so that I can see a lot of different things. And the reason I do this is because I don't want the amplitude of these waves to change as I scroll along, because I'm going to be comparing them. Alright. So the first thing we see are some pretty interesting structure in the sounds that we hear. Now we know that we hear sirens, but you've probably never seen what those two beeps are that the cop cam makes every couple of minutes. And this is it. So if we look at it from an energy perspective, we can see that a lot of energy is expended into that siren, which is right there and present. And these, there's a there's a lot of energy in a very small region, but not a lot of energy overall. But they have this very, very, very prominent structure. It looks like, you know, a bastardized goalpost for a football game or something, and it's repeated twice, and it's a very fixed interval, very fixed and narrow frequencies. So what are those frequencies? That's a little bit big. Alright, so if we move this to the right a little bit, sometimes that center line gets in the way, and expand it out. And for the log frequency, I'm going to put it back on linear scale, which means that the scale on the left is linear rather than being logarithmic. Up the amplitude, and there we can see a little bit better that it is in fact the same structure there. So in this case we're looking at a window size of 1024, which gives me a pretty good feel for what the frequencies are, but there's a little bit of shortcoming on the exact time they occur. But what I want to do is, you know, measure the frequencies. So we got two lines there. One of them occurs right around 6,000 hertz, and another occurs right around 10,000 hertz. And the width of these things, let's see, this one is 0.248 seconds. Yeah, they're probably the same, probably 0.248 in both cases. So we got two poles. We got a total of 4 percussive sounds there, and percussive means nothing more than it's a sharp rise. And in this case, broadband, that is, it has multiple frequencies, although in this case they're not very strong, except in those dominant regions. So anyway, what was the time between them? We go from peak to peak, start to start, about 0.13 seconds. Okay, and you'll see this every 2 minutes in this cop cam, because I forget exactly why. It's like if they're not being I just forget why. It's in the manual. I read it a couple times, but I've forgotten it. So that's that little beep sound that gets recorded every 2 minutes. So if we go back to a log scale so we can look at the lower frequency stuff and drop the gain back down, we can see the structure of the siren. And as we all know, sirens are pretty loud, particularly when they're very close like this one is. Alright, so let's move forward, and we'll know that the cop starts saying things straight away. And so here we can see some vocalizations. Now in the background we see the tail off with this line, again like the dinosaur hump. That's part of a siren. But these are all vocalizations, and if we expand them out we can actually see the structure, lower the bin size down to something a little bit more reasonable so that we can see the finer detail of the energy and the frequencies. So in this case we're starting to see the finer structure of what the cop was saying. And linguists would use those structures to identify the letters and vowels and consonants and all that sort of stuff. Alright, then we come upon this thing that clearly is not human generated. It's, you know, pretty straight up and down. It's short. Frequencies are consistent all the way across. And this is the radio kicking in, I believe. Let's listen. Yeah. So now you know what that looks like. But what's interesting here, to me anyway, is the amplitude. If we look closely on this bottom line, which is the waveform, we can generally see, if we zoom out, we're going to see that, alright, that these yellow regions on the waveform indicate clipping, and clipping means that the signal was pegged to the top, which means that there's lots of information being lost. And if we just run through this, you can see that, and this is when the cop was shouting, is that the cop is shouting and it pegs the meter almost always. Okay? And fascinating enough is, you see right here, I guess I need to bring up my markup tool. Come on, puppy, I know you can do it. You know, I got a lot of things open and the computer's a little bit slow because of it. Alright. So, let's go with this. I guess we'll go with the pinkish color. So anyway, right in there you see how low or small the signal is. And that's right after when the cop was saying stuff. And if you notice above, there's little energy on the power map, and it's pretty dark on the log frequency scale. And then it ramps up. You'll see here, you see this ramp on both sides. That's an indication of the automatic gain circuitry doing its thing. When the sound was loud, it had to reduce the gain, and thereby the low pressure signals, you know, the background noise and all those things far away, are essentially relegated to the trash bin, because it had to lower the gain so much to accommodate this loud shouting at very close range that there was no room left in the whatever number of bits there is in the recording signal to accommodate those low frequencies and low decibels. And even if I go to this log frequency, of course I gotta, and I increase the amplitude, you'll see that there's still very, very little stuff there. Now at this point, I've got the gain so high that it's just ridiculous. And the same is true up here. You see that there's almost no energy up there, even at crazy gain. So that's what happens when the automatic gain circuitry kicks in and then cuts out and goes back. It's I don't know what the actual algorithm is here for this one, but we can measure how long it took to do that as that's a long time, 1 second. I don't know why it took that long. Alright, so the interesting thing to note, in my opinion, is how we have a pretty definite range of sound pressures here that we can compare to when the gunshot signal finally comes along. We have the cop shouting close. We have some, eventually we'll get to some radio chatter in the background. Yeah, that looks like radio chatter there. Let's listen. Yeah, that's radio chatter, and then you better turn your sound down because it's going to get loud.
Guys, let's go!
Alright. So here we have the first volley plus the cop yelling on top of it while the volley is going off. So going back over to the there we go, saying that would be volley 11 at 125. Sorry, at 125, sure enough. So that's volley 11. Now you notice I don't have any time instance markers. I've not used this volley for muzzle blast recordings, but I have used it to measure lag. But first off, let's look at this and ask ourselves, well, how loud are those gunshots? And as you can see from the signal on the bottom, the log frequency plot, well, the gain's up quite a ways because I want to look at the gunshot. And the energy on the top is that the gunshots, the absolute value of the loudness or the pressure is substantially lower than either the cops talking or maybe even the radio background, but yet we can still hear them. So, the ear is a remarkable thing, and these electronic circuits are remarkable, and the fact that we can hear both at the same time, is kind of crazy. But anyway, so let's expand out here and look what we see. Okay, so we've nailed the volume, and These little things, those little images on there are vocalizations also, but they're substantially in the background, so that's either radio talk from the radio or somebody going by or something like that. And this is when the cop screams it. Let's take a little closer look on other places. See if there's anything else. Yeah, and once all the loudness stops, the camera probably increases the gain again so that we can get back to listening to the regular sounds in the background, which include the gunshot shots. So in this case, I'm going to proclaim that the gunshot sounds are comparable to the background noise at approximately the same level as you would hear, maybe a little bit louder than the chatter coming over the radio. And so that gives you a good idea that while we can hear them, they're not overwhelming. All right, so let's go back and we'll follow this signal along on the bottom so that you can get a little bit of a feel for what's happening. So here we have a siren. You notice how bright it is in the lower frequencies. And we have something in the upper frequency which, while not as loud for as long, it is still visible there because it is at a different frequency range. And that's the beauty of a spectrogram, is that if the interesting signals are at two different frequency ranges, you can make them out clearly almost regardless of what the sound pressure level is, provided you want to manipulate the gain on the spectrogram. So for example, in that case, if we turned the gain up, you'll see that even though I get it way up there max, the siren and the background sounds still don't overwrite the region where the two blurps from the camera are recorded. I don't know if that's intentional or not, but 6,000 to 10,000 hertz is a little bit outside the human vocal range, and I suspect that when the engineers designed the camera, they took that into account. Because who'd want this little blurp to come across when you're talking and not be able to hear the talking? Because if you're recording the voice, you might as well make sure you record it regardless of what the camera is using. And this signal is designed, I suspect, in a very specific way so that it can easily be machine detected. Alright, back to following the signal on the bottom, which is the waveform plot. So here's, I don't know if that one even works. No, it doesn't on that. So let's get a pin up here and use blue, I think works here. So you'll see that on average, this signal's running right along and through there somewhere. That's a siren. That's a loud siren. And yet, it's blown away when other sounds come along. I left it there purposely so you could see and compare it. That's the siren. Okay, so whatever that sound is right there, it's way below the siren. Here's the cop screaming. It's, we don't really know, but the latter part of it, on that bigger part, is louder than a siren, but the overtones are right in the same loudness as a siren. It's probably still talking, but not screaming, so it gets softer. But most of the signal along through here, in terms of the intensity of it and amplitude of it, are way below what the siren is doing. Then comes these little peaks here, which we know to be gunshots because we were just there and we were just looking at them. So you see that on average, the sound level for those, oops, didn't hit my pin. The sound level is way down in here for them, but they have these small regions of peaking, and that's very indicative of gunshots. Narrow, peaky, certain frequency points, certain durations, and the whole nine yards. So now that we've looked at this signal, and let's just go a little further to see if we can see anything interesting. That looks like more talking, screaming. This, I'm not sure what it is. It's probably talking. Let's listen. Yeah.
People, let's go. This is not
Okay.
training.
I need to turn the gain down in the when I'm looking at these things. They're so strong, so I can see a little bit of the structure.
Training. It's for
Yeah.
real.
All right, let's keep going. And see what we can, if there's something interesting that happened. It looks like a little up and down blurb of some kind. Let's listen. Who knows what it was? Kind of has that feel of a gunshot, but I'd have to look at it closer. Oh, I know it would. Let's go back. And I see a couple more over there. Oh, that's those signals again. I see those signals from the camera. So we're 2 minutes and 30 seconds in, of course. There they are. But here the screaming is so loud that the gain makes them invisible unless I turn the gain way up. Yeah. Alright. So, what's that? Talking, more talking. These look pretty up and down. This is talking louder.
Hey officers, please stay calm. Just relax. We're trying to get this set up. Okay, just stay calm.
Yeah. Alright. And then we keep going. Oh no, here's something way... no. Well, I tell you what, let's drop down to this lower region here. And you notice all the yellow. That's regions where the sound was clipped. Our little window that we're looking at up here is way to the left. But we notice out here at 22 minutes and 50 some seconds that there's these little spikes. And you might look at them and say, well, that looks like gunshots. But in fact, if we carefully look at them, I can tell you right now that they are not, because they don't have enough regular pattern. But with the energy spread the way they are, I can tell you that their source is some kind of a natural process, because you have so many different peaks at so many different frequencies and so many different intensities that it's almost a random process. So if you listen to it, there's probably some natural cause there. Yeah, and so in this case we've got some wind blowing across, some wind or something blowing across the microphone, causing those things. But back to our gunshot thing. So let's move over to where we saw the gunshot. And you notice I said saw, not heard. Okay, that's radio chatter there. And here comes the gunshots. Expand it out. And as you can see, we know that that volley is long just from our experience with the volleys. We up the gain, and we can start to see two things. One is the largest part of the signal is at these lower frequencies, which, if I move this guy out of the way for the moment, occurs, somewhere down in the 6-7 hertz range and peaking at about a kilohertz. So that's muzzle blast. And then up here we start to see just these itty bitty little things around somewhere from 2200 up to 3300, and those are most likely the muzzle blast, which if we increase the amplitude enough to see not muzzle blast, but supersonic crack. If we increase these enough to get a good look at those supersonic cracks, yeah, you can see that they're up there near the 2700 hertz. So here we have an opportunity at 3,000 feet away to measure both supersonic cracks and muzzle blasts. Now once the cops start talking, it just obliterates the whole scene. So I don't have this video and the sounds in it mapped out anywhere in my database except to measure the lag. And that's because there's so much things going over on top of the signal that it really doesn't provide too much of a solid signal to work with and record in an accurate manner. I always like to use signals that are clear and consistent and capture the whole volley in a way that I can then compare with other volleys. Now, so let's go ahead and use this to measure the lag. So pull up our measuring tool, lay it over on top of the log frequency plot, starting at the first observable supersonic crack, and continuing on. There's another crack, there's a crack, and then we hit a muzzle blast. And we see then that the lag between the time that the first supersonic crack arrived and the first muzzle blast arrived is 0.347 seconds, or 347 milliseconds. And that's what I've used this video for, is to measure the lag, because if you'll remember, and look at this thing wiped off, I plotted up lag over many locations, and now pardon my messy desktop here, needs cleaning up. You know, I go a week or two and then I have to clean it up. Alright, this is a lag plot, and so we said 0.3 something, 0.35 something, right? And that would be somewhere in the yellow, maybe a little bit of green. Okay, so where are we? Well, you'll notice in this case up here, way out on the right hand side, there's something in the yellow, and so I have recorded that lag in this, or something close to it in this, and it helped pull this region of yellow out there. And what I really should do is go back and find all the viable candidates for lag measurement and fill it in so that the irregularities in this map are cleaned up. But that's a project for, you know, down the road. And that's how some of this map was filled in. And I used that cop recording cam out there at Duke Ellington Boulevard, 3,000 feet away from the Mandalay Bay, to help define the shape of this map. Alright, let's see. Back to our keep that crap out of the way. Alrighty, so what else do I want to say about this? Well, I guess let's take back a look at see if there's anything else interesting that we can say about this. So in this case, the supersonic crack is significantly softer than the well, I don't know if it's softer, but it's certainly a different frequency range, yes. I would say that, yeah, it's probably softer than the muzzle blast. If we listen to just them, right there. Yeah, they're kind of hard to hear. Whereas if we listen to just the muzzle or the muzzle blashes with those in the background, yeah, the muzzle blashes are much easier to distinguish. So in this case, the supersonic crack is softer than the muzzle, which is kind of indicated in the energy map. It's hard to read this top level energy map because of the things are allocated to frequency boxes. So a short blip that's a little wider than a tall blip that's narrower. I mean, a little narrow. The supersonic crack is narrower than the muzzle blast, so these become wider, but they're at such a lower frequency range, and the ear has a nonlinear response to frequencies. It's hard sometimes when they're close like this to say exactly which is louder. But the rule of thumb is that, you know, the brighter the signal, the more intense it is to the ear. Alright. And in this video, talking, sirens, and radio background are loud enough to to override the gunshot sounds, which is kind of expected at 3,000 feet. Now, if I were ever to make a reel of definitive statements on the loudness of this, I'd have to go and measure these things in numbers, and then I'd have to go back and look at the video and see what was happening to make sure that the camera, which way the camera was located, because if he has his back to the sounds, that's going to affect the high frequency sounds much more than it affects the low frequency sounds. So if the cop was looking, northeast and the sounds are coming from the southwest, then his camera is going to pick up the lower frequency sounds because they're bigger and they diffract around his body much better than it picks up the upper frequency sounds, because they don't diffract around the body so much, because they're more directional and the wavelength is smaller, and the body just blocks and absorbs them because it's wider than the wavelength. And that ties in with the last video I just did about cell phone cameras and their microphones, how the microphone orientation and the nature of the frequency of the wave and the size of the wave can have a great impact on what's recorded. And that's also true for the cop cam. If they're looking away from the sound source, then they're naturally going to record a softer signal. How much is a function of the frequency, the angle at which the cop cam is to the sound, and a whole bunch of other factors, how loud the signal is to begin with, and a whole bunch of other factors. Anyway, this was a real example of what the last video was talking about, and even though it's not cell phone, the same concept applies to the patrolman cameras. I find that the patrolman cameras are a little bit slower with their gain circuitry. They're very much not aggressive in terms of how quickly the gain is adjusted and or how quickly the frequency is adjusted, and based upon the types of microphone they're using, they prefer the higher frequencies for some things and the lower frequencies for others. And generally they have a harsher sound to them than, say, the commercial smartphones. Alright, that's enough technical details on this. This is an example of the effects of automatic gain control, the effects of distance on sound and frequency, and a measurement of a lag that's 3,000 foot out from Mandalay Bay. Alright, thank you very much for listening, and we'll catch you in the next one.